Butler's Performative Acts and GenderConstitution was written in 1988. This is one of their most famous writings, and you may have heard of it before. In this article, they challenge the idea that gender is a substantial identity that we derive from sex or some aspect of our physical physiology. Instead, gender is what Butler calls a constituting act. It is a type of action that is a performance and it brings something into being. It is not something that merely expresses some sort of internal idea of who one is, some sort of core being. And it's not simply a role that society puts on us. It is something that we have to enact and do. Butler does not intend this article to give us a comprehensive theory of gender. Instead, it is offering a particular way of thinking about how we act out our gender. So the goal of this article is to show some ways in which reified and naturalized concepts of gender, so these really deeply sedimented ideas of gender we have in society, might be understood as constituted, right? Created, something we have to make, and hence capable of being constituted differently. So suggesting that gender has to be performed also suggests that we might perform it differently. A note on this word performativity, it does not mean the way people typically use it now. Often we use performativity to actually call someone out for being disingenuous. Often we talk about performative allyship or performative activism, where someone is kind of going through the actions and getting all this attention, but it doesn't mean they actually care about that cause. So we use performativity to mean something that is kind of superficial and only for appearances, and it's not actually genuine. That is not the way Butler is using it here. Instead, Butler is using something called speech act theory, which is derived from A.J. Ayer. And Ayer talks about this idea of a performative statement. And it's a very special type of utterance. You have to speak it, and it changes reality rather than simply describing something that already exists. So a lot of statements are kind of descriptive of the world around me. It's snowy today. It's warm today. I feel hungry. But there are other types of sentences that change reality. They bring something into being. For example, saying I do during a wedding ceremony, that phrase changes people's relationship to each other, and it changes the state of facts from one way to another. So that is what Butler means by performativity, is something that changes reality. Butler also uses phenomenology, which is a type of philosophy that focuses on lived experience and puts forward a very specific sense of the self. So phenomenology sees the self and subjectivity as something that we do rather than simply are. And we do it in the world with other people. It involves our actions. And so we don't necessarily have a stable entity that underlies the self that's just given to us. Instead, you are what you do. Butler begins with Beauvoir and this phrase, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. This is the aspect of phenomenology and existential phenomenology in particular that Butler wants to think about, is the fact that we have to become a gender. And that involves what Butler calls constituting acts. So Butler argues that gender doesn't really have a stable identity. There's not sort of an underlying subject that has this gender assigned to it from the beginning. Rather, we make our identity through these constituting acts that have to be laid out over time. And that means that it's something that kind of unfolds. And so for Butler, our identity is instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. You can't constitute your gender in just one act. It's kind of this ongoing process or performance. Butler is using Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of the body, which understands the body in a very specific way. So we have a physical body, correct? Merleau-Ponty knows that. But for Merleau-Ponty, we also have a lot of meaning that's a part of our body. And in that sense, the body has this sort of active process of embodying certain cultural and historic possibilities. And so the body is always appropriating things from culture and from our sort of historical context. And in that sense, the body is actually a historical idea and a set of possibilities to continually be realized. So when we act or do something with our body, we are making something that was possible actual. So that means that we are continually embodying different possibilities in our actions within this historical context. And that means that the body is never going to be simply that sort of physical, or as Butler calls it, factical materiality. Instead, the body is a materiality that bears meaning. And in that sense, the body is very complicated. So Butler's giving this complex notion of the body as meaning that has to be constituted within a particular social, historical context and cultural meaning, to think about the way that that applies to gender and the way we feel our bodies to be gendered. So if we want to think about what Butler means by performative acts that constitute our gender, what type of actions would these be? Butler calls gender a corporeal style, something that we stylistically do with our bodies, and an intentional and performative act. Butler draws out the sort of theatricality of playing out our gender because it is a shared experience and a collective action. So just like a theatrical performance is done in relation to others and involves us kind of stepping into a scene and taking on not only this role, but kind of embodying it. So we do the same things with our gender. We act out our gender. We perform our gender. And some people perform their gender very aggressively, as Cassie and Nate from Euphoria do. Butler wants to argue that gender is innovative. And even though we experience our gender as relating to others in a way where they're often upheld in sort of strict binary ways, and we're punished if we don't act out our gender appropriately, Butler wants to think about more possibilities as being there. So Butler argues that gender is not passively scripted on the body, right? So it's not something that is just assigned to our body passively. And also, it's not given to us by nature or language, the symbolic, or the overwhelming history of patriarchy. Gender is what is put on invariably, under constraint, daily and incessantly, with anxiety and pleasure. But if this continuous act is mistaken for a natural or linguistic given, power is relinquished to expand the cultural field of bodily through subversive performances of various kinds. So Butler is trying to think about how seeing gender as a performance gives us agency to kind of do innovative and interesting things with our gender.